The silent highway. It was a Tuesday night in early November when Ryan Caldwell disappeared. The 34-year-old insurance adjuster was on his way home from a business trip, driving through the rural highways of western Pennsylvania. He had called his wife, Melissa, around 8:45 p.m., telling her he had stopped for gas and would be home in roughly 2 hours. That was the last time anyone heard from him. The following morning, state troopers found his car idling on the shoulder of Route 53, its headlights cutting through the fog. The driver's door was wide open. The engine was running. His phone and wallet were on the passenger seat. The only signs of him were a set of footprints in the damp earth, leading away from the vehicle, then stopping abruptly in the middle of the road. There was no blood, no struggle, no sign of a crash. It was as if he had stepped out of existence. 3 weeks before he went missing, Ryan had started noticing something strange. He first mentioned it casually to Melissa, laughing as he described it. "It's weird," he said. "Every time I check my rearview mirror on these long drives, I feel like there's a car just far enough back that I can't quite make out the make or model. But when I look again, it's gone." Melissa told him he was just tired. "You drive too much," she had said. "Your brain is playing tricks on you." Maybe she was right. But then it got worse. On his last trip, he had booked a stay at a roadside motel just outside Altoona. It was the kind of place with buzzing neon lights and a faded sign reading vacancy. The man at the front desk barely looked up when Ryan checked in, sliding the key across the counter without a word. Room 108. Ryan had settled in, exhausted, when he heard it. A single knock at the door. Not a hard rap, just a dull, deliberate tap. Ryan paused. He hadn't ordered food. He hadn't spoken to anyone except the clerk. Another knock. "Who is it?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. No answer. Cautiously, he moved toward the peephole, pressing his eye against the glass. Nothing. Just the dimly lit walkway outside, empty. He waited a moment, then turned away. Knock. The sound was closer this time. He spun around, breath catching. Someone was out there. He swung the door open in one swift motion, but the hallway was empty. A single wet footprint glistened on the cement outside his door, leading from nowhere. Ryan didn't sleep that night. He kept the lamp on, staring at the door, expecting another knock. But it never came. The next morning, he checked out without a word, eager to put distance between himself and that motel. He told himself he had imagined it, maybe a trick of exhaustion or stress. By midday, he was back on the road, the Pennsylvania hills stretching endlessly before him. The radio crackled with static as he adjusted the dial. And then he saw it. A black sedan in his rearview mirror. It wasn't tailgating, wasn't passing. Just far enough back that he couldn't quite make out the details. Ryan's pulse quickened. He switched lanes. The car stayed in the same position. Frowning, he slowed down, letting it pass. But it didn't. He turned onto a smaller state route, his stomach tightening. The sedan followed. Ryan tried to brush it off. Just another car on the road. But an hour later, as the sun dipped below the tree line, it was still there. Then, without warning, it vanished. He blinked, gripping the wheel. The road stretched empty behind him. He exhaled, laughing nervously at himself. Losing it, he muttered. That was the last call he made to Melissa. The last time anyone heard his voice. The investigation turned up nothing. No witnesses. No suspects. No indication of foul play. Just an abandoned car and a man who walked into the dark and never returned. Melissa searched for months, plastering flyers across small towns, pleading with authorities to dig deeper. But they never found him. 6 months later, a trucker passing through Route 53 late at night reported seeing a man standing on the side of the road near mile marker 112. He described him as tall, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, his face pale and expressionless. When the trucker slowed, the figure stepped forward. Then, he was gone. The trucker swerved, heart hammering, his headlights catching nothing but an empty road. The state troopers dismissed it as exhaustion, a trick of the fog. But Melissa knew better. Because when she saw the report, something caught her eye. The trucker had described a wet footprint near where the figure had stood. Just one. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. The Vanishing Room. It started with a hotel. A simple, unremarkable hotel, the kind that dotted highways in small towns, the kind business travelers like Darren Green stayed in without a second thought. He had checked into the Blackwood Inn on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, after a long day of client meetings. The hotel was dated, faded wallpaper, flickering overhead lights, but he was too exhausted to care. He just needed a place to sleep. Darren was given room 303. When he reached the third floor, the hallway felt off. The air was heavier here, thick with a scent he couldn't place, something stale like damp wood or old dust. The fluorescent lighting overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds. As he walked toward his room, he passed a housekeeper standing motionless in front of room 309. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't turn, just stood there staring at the door. Unnerved, Darren quickly slipped his keycard into the reader and entered his room. Inside, the room was ordinary. A king-sized bed, a wooden desk, a television mounted on the wall. But something wasn't right. The air was freezing, much colder than the hallway outside. The thermostat was set to 72, but it felt like an icebox. He turned it off, hoping the room would warm up. Then came the knocking. Soft at first. Just a single knock at the door. Darren sighed, assuming it was housekeeping, and went to answer it. No one was there. He stepped into the hallway, glancing both ways. Empty. Even the housekeeper was gone. He closed the door and locked it. Moments later, another knock. Louder this time. He turned quickly, yanking the door open. Again, nothing. Annoyed, he placed the security latch over the door and went to bed. He was halfway asleep when the TV turned on by itself, blasting static. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The remote was on the nightstand, untouched. As he reached for it, the screen flickered, shifting from static to a dim, shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the room. He froze. The figure didn't move. It didn't have a face, just a dark, elongated shape, barely visible through the grainy static. Then, in an instant, the TV shut off. The room plunged into silence. Darren didn't sleep. The next morning, Darren went to the front desk. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 40s, barely glanced up. "Everything okay?" he asked. Darren hesitated. "Did someone die in room 303? The clerk's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. He looked up slowly, his face pale. "We don't have a room 303. Darren frowned. "What are you talking about? I stayed there last night?" The clerk swallowed hard. "Sir, the third floor doesn't have a room 303. That room hasn't existed for years." Darren's stomach dropped. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his hotel confirmation. Room 303. He looked around the lobby, desperate for an explanation. That's when he saw it. Behind the clerk, mounted on the wall, was an old framed photograph. A black and white picture of the hotel from decades ago. The image showed the third-floor hallway, the same one he had walked down the night before. But where his room should have been, there was nothing but a blank wall. Darren left the hotel in a daze, convincing himself it had been a mistake. A mix-up in records. A trick of the mind. He got into his car, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. 15 minutes later, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You forgot something in room 303. He nearly drove off the road. His hands trembled as he unlocked his phone. He wanted to delete the message, pretend it never happened. But before he could, another message came through. "Look in your backseat." Cold terror seized his chest. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. Slowly he turned his head. A figure was sitting in the back seat, shrouded in darkness. The last thing Darren saw before everything went black was a pair of hollow, empty eyes staring at him through the rearview mirror. Darren Green was found 3 days later, his car abandoned on a deserted road 20 miles outside of Columbus. The engine was running, the driver's side door wide open. His phone was on the dashboard, the screen cracked. There were no signs of a struggle. No evidence of where he had gone. Only the driver's seat remained, damp with the unmistakable imprint of someone who had sat there long after Darren had vanished. Months later, strange reports began surfacing from other travelers staying at the Blackwood Inn. Guests would wake in the middle of the night to knocking on their doors. Some claimed to hear footsteps pacing outside their rooms. Others swore they caught glimpses of a figure standing at the end of the hallway, always just out of reach. One woman, shaken and pale, told the front desk clerk she had checked into room 303, only to wake up in the hotel storage closet, the door locked from the outside. Her luggage was gone, her room key nowhere to be found. Security footage showed her walking into her room and never coming out. The Blackwood Inn has since closed, its doors shuttered, its windows boarded. But those who pass by at night swear they still see a dim, flickering light from the third-floor window where room 303 should have been. Where it never was. Where something still waits. Brace yourself, because the next story is even more disturbing. The missing hour started with something small. So small that, at first, I convinced myself I had imagined it. It was October 2019, and I was on a work trip in Colorado, staying in a modest Airbnb in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Denver. I had landed that evening, rented a car, and driven the 45 minutes to my stay. The house was a cozy, single-story unit, the kind that felt safe, surrounded by neat little lawns and porches decorated with fall wreaths and pumpkins. The first thing that felt off was the front door. When I arrived, it was slightly ajar. Not enough to be alarming, maybe the previous guest hadn't closed it properly. The owner had left a note saying the place had been cleaned that morning, so I figured someone had just been careless. Inside, everything was as expected. Clean, warm, lived in but impersonal. I set down my bag, checked the doors, locked them, and double-checked them before heading to bed. I woke up at 2:08 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, just different. It wasn't a creak or a thud, nothing that screamed danger. More like a shuffle. The kind you might hear if someone were barefoot on the carpet. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. The house had a smart thermostat, so maybe the vents had turned on. I checked my phone, noted the time, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, nothing was out of place. I chalked it up to travel nerves and went about my day. Meetings, emails, calls. I came back that evening, had a microwave dinner, and watched TV. At 1:57 a.m., I woke up again. This time it was a distinct sound. A click. Like a door latch. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, trying to catch another sound. Then a soft creak. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I sat up, scanning the room, feeling the rush of adrenaline that made every sound, every shadow, feel like an impending threat. The apartment was silent, but the air felt off. Like something had changed, something imperceptible but real. I stood, checked the closet, empty. I walked into the living room, my bare feet silent on the carpet. Nothing seemed out of place. The front door was still locked, the windows latched. I convinced myself I must have left the door open. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. I went back to bed, but I barely slept. The next morning, I checked the Nest camera the owner had set up outside. It recorded motion at the front door. At 2:03 a.m. there was a clip. It showed the door opening slightly. Then nothing. No one. I stared at the screen, my fingers cold. I replayed it. The door moved, but no one was there. That day, I told myself I was being ridiculous. The wind, maybe. A faulty latch. But that night, I set up my phone to record. Just in case. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. drenched in sweat. The air felt thick, suffocating. I reached for my phone and checked the recording. My stomach dropped. At 2:06 a.m., the bedroom door slowly swung open. Then at 2:07, a shadow moved across the floor. Not fast. Not darting. It stretched, elongated by the glow of the streetlight outside. It was the shape of a person. But I had heard nothing. The shadow moved toward my bed. And then the screen went black. My phone was at 70% when I started recording. When I checked the battery, it had drained completely. I packed my bags and left before sunrise. I checked out early, telling the host a family emergency had come up. I drove straight to the airport and booked the next available flight home. Later that night, I checked my phone's camera roll. The recording wasn't there. I know I hit record. I remember watching it. But the file was gone. I still don't know what happened in that house. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is that I can't account for the time between 2:07 and 3:14 a.m. It's as if that hour simply disappeared. A week later, back home, I was scrolling through my emails when I saw a message from the Airbnb host. The subject line read, "Just checking in." I hesitated before opening it. "Hi, I hope your stay was alright. Just wanted to ask, did you happen to lose anything while you were here?" The cleaner found a phone charger and something else. A notebook tucked under the bed. It has some scribbles in it, but the pages from the middle seem torn out. "Let me know if you want me to mail it to you." I hadn't brought a notebook. And I hadn't left anything behind. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse in my throat. Then another email arrived. Same sender. No subject. I clicked it open. It was a single line. "I saw you on the camera at 2:07 a.m. I barely slept that night." The next morning I decided to reply. My hands trembled as I typed a response. "Can you send me the footage?" Minutes later, my inbox chimed. The email contained a video attachment. With hesitation, I clicked play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The door opened slightly. A moment later, my sleeping form shifted, as if something had brushed against me. Then a dark figure moved into the room. It stood next to my bed, watching. The file ended there. No explanation. No movement away. Just watching. Now for another dark and haunting tale that will send shivers down your spine. The Vanishing Room. I first heard about the Belhaven Motel from a travel blog that praised it as a hidden gem for weary travelers passing through the Appalachian foothills. Nestled off a quiet highway, the motel was small. Only 10 rooms in a neat row, their doors painted a faded blue. It had an old-fashioned neon sign out front, flickering slightly but still bright against the darkness. It seemed like the perfect, unassuming place to rest after a long day of driving. I checked in just after dusk. The clerk, an elderly man with thick glasses, slid a heavy key across the desk. "Room 7, he said. "Enjoy your stay." There was something off about his tone, polite but distant, as if he had given that same line 1,000 times and stopped caring long ago. The room was basic but clean. A queen bed, a desk, a nightstand with an old rotary phone that didn't seem to be connected. The window faced the parking lot, where my car was the only one parked. The air had a faint musty smell, the kind of scent that clung to places long forgotten. I didn't think much of it until I stepped into the bathroom. There was a mirror above the sink, and for a moment I could have sworn the reflection was delayed, just by a fraction of a second. I waved a hand experimentally, but the reflection followed normally. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just exhausted. That night I slept fitfully. I woke up once to the sound of something shifting outside my door. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. When I gathered enough courage to check, the peephole showed nothing but an empty walkway. The neon sign still flickered outside, casting uneasy shadows. The real terror began the next morning. I walked to the front desk to return my key, but the elderly clerk wasn't there. Instead, a woman stood behind the counter, younger, with dark eyes that studied me curiously. "Checking out?" she asked. "Yeah, room 7. She frowned. "I think there's a mistake." I placed the key on the counter. "No mistake. Room 7. Her face paled slightly. "Sir, we don't have a room 7. I blinked, half laughing. "What are you talking about? I stayed there last night?" She pulled out a ledger and turned it towards me. The guest records were neatly written in ink. The rooms were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. There was no room 7. I turned toward the walkway, counting the doors. My room should have been between 6 and 8. But there was only a blank wall where room 7 should have been. No door. No window. Just a solid, seamless stretch of faded blue paint. I stumbled back, my mind racing. My car was still parked outside, my bag still in my hand. Had I imagined the entire night? "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice cautious. I didn't answer. I just grabbed my keys and left, my heart hammering in my chest. As I sped down the highway, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The neon sign flickered behind me. And for just a second, I saw room 7's door standing there, exactly where it had been the night before. Waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I drove, so I pulled into a roadside diner a few miles down. The place was quiet, mostly empty except for an old man hunched over a cup of coffee at the counter. I ordered some food, but my appetite was gone. Instead, I found myself scrolling through my phone, looking for that travel blog where I'd first read about the Belhaven Motel. I couldn't find it. The article was gone. The blog itself was still there, but the motel wasn't mentioned anywhere. Frustrated, I tried searching for the motel directly. Nothing. No website, no reviews, no address. It was as if it had never existed. "You all right there, son?" The old man at the counter was watching me, his roomy eyes sharp with something like recognition. "Yeah," I said, swallowing. "Just, weird night. Stayed at a motel back up the road. Belhaven. Ever heard of it?" His spoon clattered against his saucer. He turned pale. "Son," he said, lowering his voice, "you best forget that place." "Why?" "Because I stayed in room 7 once too." The diner felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. "What happened?" The old man shook his head. "It doesn't let you go easy." I wanted to press for more, but he stood up abruptly, tossed some bills on the counter, and walked out without another word. I watched him go, an unsettling chill settling in my bones. I didn't sleep well that night, holed up in another roadside motel. My dreams were filled with distorted reflections, flickering neon signs, and the sensation of footsteps outside my door. When I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. There was a notification. One new voicemail. With shaking hands, I pressed play. Static filled my ears at first, crackling like an old radio signal. Then, beneath it, a faint voice whispered, "You left something behind." My breath hitched. The voice was mine. I dropped the phone, my pulse hammering. I hadn't made that call. I hadn't left anything behind. Or had I? And then the motel room door creaked open. I wasn't alone. That was only the beginning. Let's see what horrors await us in the next story. The Silent Room. It started with a simple business trip. Nothing unusual. Ethan had taken dozens of flights before, booked countless hotel rooms, and spent countless nights alone in unfamiliar places. It was part of his job. This time, it was a short stay in a quiet Pennsylvania town, a last-minute booking at a boutique hotel that had good reviews but few details online. It was late when he arrived, past 11. The town was eerily still, the streets empty, the air thick with the weight of an impending storm. The hotel was a restored Victorian mansion, elegant in an outdated way. The front desk clerk, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, handed him a brass key with a polite but mechanical smile. "Room 305, she said almost too softly. "End of the hall. Please enjoy your stay." Something about the way she said it made his stomach tighten. But he ignored the feeling and took the old-fashioned elevator to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with antique paintings whose eyes seemed to follow him. He found his room at the very end, away from the others. As he turned the key and pushed the door open, the hinges let out a long, agonizing creak. The room was fine, clean but unremarkable. A queen-sized bed, a wooden armoire, a writing desk beneath a large window that overlooked the darkened street below. It smelled slightly of dust and old fabric. The air felt heavier than it should have, but again he ignored it. He set down his bag and prepared for bed, his exhaustion outweighing any sense of unease. As he lay under the stiff white sheets, he noticed something odd. The room was silent. Too silent. No humming from the air vent, no distant sound of traffic, no murmur of voices from adjacent rooms. The absolute stillness pressed against his ears. It was the kind of silence that made his own breathing feel intrusive. Ethan closed his eyes and told himself he was just overtired. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime after midnight, he stirred, heart pounding for no reason he could place. His body was stiff, his mouth dry. Then he heard it. A shuffle. Soft, deliberate. Inside the room. He froze, his pulse hammering. His eyes darted toward the door. It was still locked. His suitcase was untouched, the furniture unmoved. Slowly, he reached for his phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. He swept the beam across the room. Nothing. The door to the armoire stood slightly ajar, though he didn't remember leaving it that way. He swallowed, forcing himself to get up. His feet felt heavier than they should have as he crossed the room and gripped the armoire's wooden handle. With a deep breath, he yanked it open. Empty. He let out a shaky laugh, scolding himself for being so paranoid. But as he turned back toward the bed, a single detail made his blood run cold. The bedsheets had been disturbed, as if someone had been lying there while he was checking the armoire. He didn't sleep that night. He sat up in the chair by the window, phone in hand, waiting for morning. Every few minutes, he glanced at the bed, half expecting to see the sheets move on their own. At dawn, he packed up and went downstairs, deciding to check out early. The same woman was at the desk. When she saw him, something flickered in her expression, something like knowing. "How was your stay?" she asked, voice too neutral. Ethan hesitated. "Fine. Just weird night." She nodded as if she had heard it before. Then after a pause she said, "You're lucky." He frowned. "Lucky?" She glanced toward the staircase leading up to the rooms, lowering her voice. "Most people don't wake up." A chill crawled up his spine. He wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her gaze told him he didn't want to know. He left without another word, stepping into the cold morning air. As he pulled away from the hotel, he checked the rearview mirror. From the third-floor window of room 305, the curtains had been drawn back. A silhouette stood there watching him leave. And it wasn't his own. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease even hours later. The highway stretched before him, endless and gray, but his mind was still trapped in that room. The silence, the shuffle, the sheets. He stopped at a gas station to grab coffee. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a bored expression, rang up his purchase. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan hesitated. "Stayed at a place back in town. Belmont Inn. Ever heard of it?" The clerk went still. "You mean the old manor? It's been closed for years." Ethan's grip on his coffee tightened. "No, I know, I just stayed there. Last night. Room 305. The man shook his head slowly. "Son, that place burned down in 1987. Third floor was the worst. No one made it out." Ethan felt the world tilt around him. He fumbled for his phone, pulling up the hotel's website. But the page refused to load. His booking confirmation? Gone. His call log? Nothing from the number he had dialed for reservations. He rushed to his car, heart racing. He needed proof, anything. He opened his suitcase, searching for the brass key from room 305. It wasn't there. Instead, nestled in the folds of his clothes, was a single object that didn't belong to him. A room key. Old, tarnished. Engraved with the number 305. Our next story takes us deeper into the darkness. Hold on tight. Echoes in the dark. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. That's what Julia had told herself when she booked the secluded cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. She needed time to clear her head, to escape the relentless grind of city life, and most importantly, to be alone. The drive was longer than she expected, winding through narrow forest roads that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath a canopy of dense pine trees. By the time she reached the cabin, dusk had settled, casting long claw-like shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin was charming but old, its wooden walls worn by time and weather. A small porch overlooked the dense thicket of trees, and beyond that, nothing but wilderness. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. Exactly what she wanted. Inside, the air smelled of aged timber and something else, something faint, metallic. The layout was simple. A cozy living room with a fireplace, a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and a bathroom. She dropped her bag on the couch and took a deep breath. That first night, she slept soundly. The forest outside was alive with sounds, owls hooting, branches rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But it was natural, comforting. The second night she noticed it, the silence. It was the absence of sound that woke her. No wind, no nocturnal animals, no distant howls. Just a suffocating, unnatural stillness. She lay in bed, ears straining for anything. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the cabin's front door. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the clock, 2:37 a.m. Who would be out here at this hour? Heart hammering, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The porch light cast a weak glow, illuminating the small steps leading to the door. But no one was there. She exhaled shakily. Maybe an animal had bumped into the door. Then, just as she was about to turn away, knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. More insistent. Julia's body went rigid. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi router was in the living room, and she wasn't about to walk through the dark cabin to get to it. She grabbed the fireplace poker instead and stood by the door, willing herself to breathe. The knocking stopped. She stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When she finally dared to open the door, nothing was there. No footprints on the porch, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That day, she hiked to the highest ridge near the cabin, hoping to get a signal. When her phone finally buzzed to life, she sent a message to her friend, Mark. Julia, I think someone was outside my cabin last night. No signal here, but I'll try to call later. Just wanted someone to know. His response was immediate. Mark, where are you? I got a message from you at 2:40 a.m. Just static and breathing. I thought it was a prank. Julia felt ice spread through her veins. She hadn't made any calls that night. That evening, she locked every door and window before dark. The feeling of being watched had settled into her bones, making her skin prickle with unease. Every creak of the old cabin made her jump. At 2:37 a.m., she sat in bed, gripping the fireplace poker, listening. Waiting. The knocking didn't come. Instead, something worse did. The whispering. It started as a faint murmur just outside the bedroom window. Then it grew louder, urgent, insistent. A chorus of hushed voices overlapping, too many at once. Julia clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling to her. Then all at once, silence. The air was heavy, thick with something she couldn't name. And then, slowly, so slowly, she heard the sound of her closet door creaking open behind her. She ran. Barefoot into the freezing night, she sprinted down the narrow dirt road, not daring to look back. She ran until her lungs burned, until she collapsed near the highway, where a passing truck finally stopped for her. When the police arrived, they found the cabin undisturbed. No signs of forced entry. No footprints besides hers. Nothing to suggest that anyone else had been there. But her phone was sitting neatly on the nightstand. And on its screen was a single notification. One new voice recording. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. Static. Then a deep, rattling breath. Then her own voice, distorted, whispering. Don't let me out. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.